Hello and welcome to Power Problems, a podcast from the Cato Institute, where we offer a skeptical take on U.S. foreign policy and discuss some of today's big questions in international security with guests from across the political spectrum. I'm Trevor Thrall, and filling in today for Emma is Eric Gomez, a policy analyst here at Cato. Hi, Eric.
Hey.
Today on Power Problems, we're going nuclear. Specifically, we're going to dig into the nuclear state of play in Asia, where there is a lot happening these days. For starters, we have North Korea, where talks have just broken down between North Korea and the United States. On the heels of North Korea testing missile systems sort of willy-nilly, I hear that's a technical term, making all sorts of folks nervous, although maybe not Trump, can't tell. We also have rising tensions between Pakistan and India over the situation in Kashmir, raising again questions about how both countries view the role and potential use of nuclear weapons. And China's nuclear forces are also worth tracking, both due to the way that nuclear deterrence factors into U.S.-China great power competition, as well as the Trump administration's efforts to bring Beijing into arms control agreements. And those are just some of the highlights. So today we're fortunate to have a leading expert on these issues with us. Vipin Narang is an associate professor of political science at M.I.T. and a member of M.I.T.'s Security Studies program. Welcome for joining us.
Thanks, Trevor. Thanks, Eric. Great to be here.
Fantastic. All right, let's get right into it. And let's just start with North Korea, since that's just most recently in the news. The United States met with North Korean folks in Stockholm, and after the talks ended in what I heard was a disgusting failure.
Acrimonious.
Acrimonious and disgusting failure, according to the North Koreans. It doesn't necessarily look like there'll be more talks. Does it matter? Where was this heading? Is there anything that could happen next? Where do you see this?
I mean, I've been skeptical from the beginning about what the gulf between the U.S. and North Korea and what the purpose of the talks are. I think even if the U.S. shows up with a comprehensive denuclearization deal that can be implemented in a step-by-step fashion, as Steve Biegun outlined at Stanford, which is certainly better than the John Bolton model, which is forcing North Korea to surrender everything, the whole enchilada plus the guacamole and sour cream, before it gets any sanctions relief. The North Koreans are not interested in talking about disarmament. They're talking, I think the purpose for the North Koreans in the talks is to ratify their status as a nuclear weapons power. And I think if we look at this week in particular, it was only Tuesday that the SLBM, the Pukasong 3 was tested from either an underwater barge or pontoon. It was a solid fuel missile, but that was basically, since 2017, it was the first explicitly nuclear capable system that was tested. And, the message I don't think should be lost on the world in the United States. Several days before working level talks were supposed to begin, it was basically, we're a nuclear weapons power. We're here to stay, and we're not giving this up. You test Tridents on a regular basis. You test your Minutemen 3. We're going to test our SLBMs. And so if you go into working level talks thinking we're going to roll back our program, you have another thing coming. I think, the talks may have broken down this particular time, but this is also, if you're North Korea, what is your optimal strategy? This is kind of what North Korea does. It's designed to build leverage. I don't think the North Koreans are going to walk away entirely and forever. This rope-a-dope strategy they're playing, stalling on meeting with the U.S., then walking out, but dangling the hope that you can have future talks, works perfectly for them, because what does it do? It buys time. And if you're a nuclear weapons power that has, where North Korea probably is right now, is a minimum deterrent. They have a liquid fuel ICBM capability. There are doubts about the reentry vehicle, but I, for one, am not willing to dare them to test it to show us that it works. I'm willing to bet, even if it works 10% of the time, I'm not willing to bet 10% chance that Los Angeles is going to get destroyed in a retaliatory strike. And so they have a minimum deterrent for political purposes. But like all normal nuclear powers, they have an interest in developing solid fuel missiles, a wide range of capabilities, improving their force. If you're facing the U.S., you may want a bigger force than North Korea has. So time, for all the time that passes before there is a deal, of any sort that, even just basically ratifies their status as nuclear weapons power, North Korea keeps expanding and improving its force. And I think we may look back at the Hanoi offer, and if it was real, if it was the real deal and Kim Jong-un was willing to, shut down the Yongbyon facility, and a lot of the modalities would have still had to be working. Who's going to go first? Could we pour concrete in the reactor? But if you could shut down the only known source of plutonium and constrain the future composition of the force, that's not nothing. And if that was on the table, I think we may look back and regret walking away from that because it may have put meaningful constraints on the growth of the North Korean nuclear program. And it's not clear that'll be back on the table anytime soon, given, if Kim Jong-un is looking at President Trump's domestic political situation here, he may think, look, President Trump may be my best bet, but I also know that President Trump at this point is not going to do anything to start a war. And so he can continue to play this game almost indefinitely. And I think that's kind of how I would look at the way the talks broke down. So I don't think they broke down entirely. I think the North Koreans will continue to keep the channels open and dangle the hope of future talks and just drag it out. But there is this clear end-of-year deadline that the North Koreans have repeatedly reinforced and emphasized. And it's unclear to me what happens at the end of the year. I mean, we just saw an SLBM test, and I wonder what happens after an SLBM test. You could imagine a longer-range land-based test. You can imagine a satellite launch vehicle, which kind of looks like an ICBM but isn't. You could imagine another ICBM test. Worst case scenario, we may get a resumption of nuclear testing. So I think I don't want to call Kim Jong-un's bluff, because every time the North Koreans have said they're going to do something, they've pretty much done it. So I'm a little concerned about what happens at the end of the year and whether Kim Jong-un rings in the new year with a fireworks show. And on the hope that President Trump, or the gamble that President Trump doesn't do anything about it, which so far has, proven to be a pretty good bet for Kim Jong-un. He tested the SLBM and President Trump didn't seem to care. And the North Koreans walked away when, they basically stated their version of events was the U.S. showed up without a so-called new calculation after the Hanoi summit. And so I think we have to see where things go. But I'd be surprised if the North Koreans shut down the dialogue completely, given that their interest is basically just to buy time at this point.
And when you said that we might be looking back and really wanting what we left at Hanoi, I think I tweeted exactly that when the Hanoi summit failed. I said, 6 months from now, you're going to wish you had this deal. It looks like we're right on
Good
time.
prediction, yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, and just the way the North Koreans have played for time. After President Trump shows up at Panmunjom, we have the spate of missile tests. Kind of in response to the Dongmeng exercises between the U.S. and South Korea. And he just, he basically puts his head in the sand, but all of those are solid fuel missiles. They're a nightmare for regional missile defenses. And, all of those technologies, you can't, it's not necessarily, easy to graft them onto the ICBMs, but they're getting more comfortable and experienced with solid fuel. And, those are things that we don't necessarily want to see in their ICBM force, because it makes the ICBM force more responsive, more survivable. And, it's plausible that we may look back and say, if we thought that working level talks were going to be 2 to 3 weeks after President Trump's July visit to Panmunjom, and then we're, at 4 months later, and the State Department, after the talks just broke down, said, we'll meet again in 2 to 3 weeks. So the North Koreans have shown no interest, it sounds like, in meeting that quickly. And they played for time, and they played for time pretty well, because, I think Kim Jong-un has decided, why waste your time with working level talks? If the president is interested in another summit, I'm just going to hold out for that.
And speaking of Trump, where do you see not only sort of during Trump, but also the next administration after him? Because I think that on the plus side, I've been more optimistic, I think, for most of this process, and now I'm probably at where you are in terms of level of pessimism about where things go from here. But, I think that leader-to-leader contact between the U.S. and North Korea in general is a positive thing, because it could enable certain discussions to happen that previously we couldn't get done. But I don't see that happening under Trump himself, just because of who he is and also his domestic situation
I think
now.
2 things. One, if you're Kim Jong-un, you think that your best bet is Trump. I mean, President Trump has shown no inclination to start a war with North Korea over anything, or pressure Kim Jong-un over anything. I think the risk that Kim Jong-un makes is that if he pushes Trump too far, especially right now, given the domestic political situation, Trump has shown a proclivity to do a 180, right? If he thinks somebody's been disloyal or, has violated or betrayed him, we can see Trump can turn 180. So that's a gamble that Kim Jong-un is taking. I think the other thing I would say is that the leader-to-leader summit, Singapore, in general, I wasn't opposed to the leader-to-leader summit. I think the problem was that Kim Jong-un basically short-circuited the working level talks beforehand. And so the leader-to-leader summit happened too early. And I think that was a signal to Kim Jong-un that he can dispense with the working level talks. And the North Koreans have always said in working level talks that they have no authority to talk about nuclear weapons. And they now use that basically as an excuse not to discuss nuclear weapons related issues. It sounds like, based on what we're reading, who knows what the actual negotiations are like. But it seems like based on the reporting on both sides, there's no real discussion of even the meaning of denuclearization because only Kim Jong-un can do that, which is their excuse and method to get back to the leader-to-leader summit. And so once President Trump not only went to Singapore, but then Hanoi and then Panmunjom, without working level talks ahead of time, it just laid the groundwork for, this North Korean strategy of just dispensing with working level talks and using that basically as a vehicle to get to the leader-to-leader summit by walking out, right? Because if Kim Jong-un can say, forget the working level talks, but I'll still meet with you one-on-one, and then we'll just rinse and repeat. I just don't know how many more rinse cycles we have before the washing machine blows up.
Well, I think Trump's shot his last shot on this. I don't see. I mean, he could do a 180. Fine. That's a whole different story. I don't think they have much. I mean, after
what's left to talk about
after maximum pressure times how many X's can you put in the word maximum, and then you're out of ideas. So the question for me is sort of thinking beyond Trump's first term. Good Lord willing. Is it time to pivot to arms control instead of denuclearization?
I think we should have done that. I mean, that was from day one.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the problem was, so if you look at the sequence of the summit, Singapore was basically the broad guidelines from the North Korean perspective. If you look at the sequence, except for POWs, the sequence of commitments at Singapore is exactly what the North Koreans probably put on the table. And because they ran the clock on the working level talks right before Singapore, basically, I don't think we had an option or an alternative but to accept basically that sequence and some of the language. Hanoi was, basically an attempt to implement some of the guidelines in Singapore, but Kim Jong-un showed up in Hanoi basically looking to ratify him, North Korea as a nuclear weapons power. When that didn't happen, I think there was a lot of consternation within the North Korean system. The lead negotiator we haven't seen or heard from him since. But, there was, I think, a little bit of disappointment about how they misread President Trump, because I think at Hanoi, we also, maybe they didn't read the Michael Cohen situation or the domestic political situation here at that time correctly. And so Trump basically, bolted Kim Jong-un, and that led to a real setback. And then the third meeting is at Panmunjom to pick up the 15 yards we lost at Hanoi, just to get things going again, because Kim Jong-un was, licking his wounds and trying to figure out how to go forward. And Trump shows up at Panmunjom, and if you look at the body language at Panmunjom, it was very interesting because Trump was very warm. But if you look at the video, at least from my perspective, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, which is often the case, the body language from Kim Jong-un was interesting. He seemed uncomfortable. He wasn't warm. He wasn't laughing. He never looked directly at President Trump. And I think they were still trying to figure out what the U.S. calculation was. And I think what made it worse in retrospect was that it sounds like President Trump, if Alex Ward's reporting from Vox last week is accurate, and I have no reason to believe it wasn't because it was confirmed, I think, by Time Magazine then, that President Trump basically committed to Kim Jong-un there that he would suspend the Dongmanga exercises. And when that didn't happen, then we saw the spate of new missile tests, the MLRS, the KN-23, and then we saw the prototype submarine, and then we saw the SLBM test. And so there may be a real sense of betrayal from Kim Jong-un, thinking, what's the point of this? If he's not going to ratify the fact that I'm a nuclear weapons power, I dare him to take them away by force. And with Bolton out of office, the argument for that is probably gone. And if maximum pressure has no air left in it, time is on Kim Jong-un's side, and the force is getting bigger, it's getting better. And so in a lot of ways, this is Kim Jong-un's maximum pressure campaign against us, and it's working. I mean, I don't see any way, if we don't talk about arms control, if we don't talk about slowing the growth of the program and putting the caps that, or at least constraining the composition of the force the way it seemed like he might have been willing to do in Hanoi, then, at the end, this all benefits Kim Jong-un and North Korea, I think.
So we could talk about North Korea all day long, but to move on to other parts of the Asian region here, what about India and Pakistan?
Don't forget about India and Pakistan.
Don't forget about India and Pakistan.
My first beat. Yeah, my first beat was South Asia.
And you've gotten a lot of heat recently on the Twitter machine for some stuff you have written and said about Indian nuclear doctrine that I personally find very, very convincing, but most of Indian Twitter apparently does not find very
Well, they do
convincing.
now because their defense minister basically dispensed with no first use. I was just ahead of my time, as like I like to say. And so it's funny, the same people who were jumping on my head for, saying that India might have reservations about an absolute no first use, especially for preemption, which has long been a concern for India. Like if there was detection of imminent Pakistani nuclear use from day one, Prime Minister Vajpayee, was very uncomfortable with the fact that India wouldn't preempt Pakistan. And so when we said this 2 years ago, everyone was like, okay, you don't know what you're talking about. There's no evidence for this. Those same people were the ones jumping up and down and celebrating when the defense minister finally came out and said, India has adhered to a no first use doctrine up until today. What happens tomorrow depends on circumstances. That was August of this year, right? And so, this is a long time coming, and I really don't think, India has the doctrine is now 16 years old, and circumstances have changed. And from day one, there's always been this discomfort with an absolute no first use policy, especially if there was evidence or indications of imminent Pakistani use. There's no way a democratically elected Indian prime minister could sit back and let Pakistan use nuclear weapons on Indian citizens or forces if it knew it was coming. The more interesting development with India's no first use policy is, when the defense minister just said this, are there other circumstances beside Pakistani, imminent use where India might find it useful to use nuclear weapons first? And the obvious other scenario is if it's losing a conventional war with China, would it consider using nuclear weapons in such a circumstance? I am skeptical of that, but it's certainly, not out of the realm of theoretical possibility. I don't think there's any evidence for it at this point, but it's not, that would be the other plausible scenario where India might find it useful if it was ever in a shooting war with China. But I don't see actually how we get there in the first place. But
so how does these new sorts of developments and quotes from Indian officials graft onto the current situation in Kashmir, where India revoked its special status under the Constitution and has kicked off a lot of civil unrest in the region, and basically extolations from the Pakistani prime minister to try and figure out like a way forward, like a peaceful way forward here, because it sounds like the temperature is rising pretty rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, the revocation of Article 3, so Article 370 granted special status to Kashmir, and as part of its agenda and its manifesto, the BJP has long said it's going to revoke Article 370. Now, supporters of the revocation say Article 370 was a temporary provision, but it required certain procedures for it to be reversed. Those conditions were legally, the justification for revoking it a little circuitous legally, but the fact is, I think it's irreversible at this point. I think this is the new status quo. The Indian government has basically reverse mortgaged Kashmir and made it a union territory. So it's under central control, and the security footprint there is quite substantial. I think they're hoping to relax the cell phone bans and the detentions of mainstream political leaders. I mean, from a PR perspective, I think the government of India has a real problem on its hands, and I don't know if it appreciates, especially here in Washington, D.C., the level of concern. I mean, Elizabeth Warren, you can say, okay, Bernie Sanders' concern is one thing, but Alice Wells, if you read the State Department statement on it after the UN, or I think it was before the UN General Assembly, and then Elizabeth Warren. I mean, there's some Senator Van Hollen. There is increasingly mainstream concern, and every day the front page of the New York Times is carrying, pictures of, the despair in Kashmir. And so the Indian government has a PR problem on its hands, at the very least. And the revocation was kind of a red flag in front of the militant organizations in Pakistan who have long said, called for the liberation of Kashmir. And, this is their kind of raison d'etre. And so my concern is actually that, we may see it may heat up before it calms down. And this is related, I think, to the February crisis between India and Pakistan, where, there was an attack on the CRPF, which is a paramilitary force in Kashmir security force by a local Kashmiri boy, but he was radicalized by a Pakistani group, the Jaish-e-Mohammed. That led to a very serious crisis between India and Pakistan. On February 26th, for the first time, I think in history, another nuclear power used air power on the mainland territory of another nuclear power directly. And that was a real escalation. The Indians have long been frustrated with what they believe to be Pakistani-backed support of terrorism on the Indian homeland and its inability to respond. And so the Modi government criticized the Congress government before it, after the Bombay attacks, for not doing anything, decided, you know what, we're going to do something this time. And they parked ordnance on mainland Pakistani territory. The Pakistanis responded the next day. Their aircraft crossed the line of control. It was kind of, I think, what they claim is an intentional miss. They didn't hit the brigade headquarters on the Indian side. But India lost a MiG-21. The pilot survived. There was a friendly fire incident where the Indians shot down one of their own Mi-17s. And so in a short engagement, the Pakistani Air Force at least held its own. And the crisis looked like it might escalate. And the Indians rattled the nuclear saber. The Pakistanis rattled the nuclear saber. You had Prime Minister Modi talking about on the campaign trail, we don't keep this in the basement. We don't keep it for Diwali, just for fireworks. The Indians want at least some audiences to believe that they deployed the INS Arihant at the height of the crisis. I mean, the chief of naval staff has indicated they deployed it. The question whether nuclear weapons on board. And if so, that might be the first time in a crisis between India and Pakistan, one side actually deployed a ready nuclear system. And we always assumed it would be the Pakistanis that would do it first, but this time it was the Indians. And so I think the Indians are getting more comfortable with the tempo of deployments with their nuclear systems, and it's this notion that the Pakistanis are going to be the first to flush out a system. With the Arihant, the Indians might be the first to go, and the Pakistanis took note of that. And a lot of this is signaling. A lot of it is rhetoric. We don't know what the Indians actually did. But the Pakistanis have taken note, and I think this informs future crises. Mm-hmm. And the problem, or my concern, is that these after the revocation of 370 in particular, these crises are going to happen again. I don't think Pakistan, the Pakistani militant groups now have, I think, a raison d'etre, and there's going to be, there's a soft underbelly in urban India, and protecting all of those urban centers is very difficult, and I'm very, very, very concerned that there will be militant attacks from Pakistan in urban India, not necessarily in J&K. I'm sure there will be, some there, but we have now set up in motion, right after the February crisis. Both sides walked away thinking they won, which is good to de-escalate that crisis, but is bad for future crises because they both think that they can get a punch in, and that escalation is good, and escalation is easy to control, and retaliation theater is good for domestic political audiences. But at some point, this isn't just a movie, right?
This is the Kashmir is the Kashmir chapter in the Nuclear Deterrence Handbook keeps growing because you have all these questions that are sort of under sort of live real-time examination. What are the limits of nuclear deterrence?
Right.
Escalating
what's the
to
space
de-escalate.
below,
What are the thresholds? What are the pathways to inadvertent escalation?
Mm-hmm.
The Sagan-Waltz debate on mistakes versus responsible, behavior. I mean, every single thing you ever learned in any class about nuclear weapons is on display right now,
right.
and it's the terrifying result.
No, absolutely. And the Indians, Prime Minister Modi in the campaign trail. So take everything Prime Minister Modi says in the campaign trail with a grain of salt campaign. But it was kind of the first time in a campaign that nuclear weapons and the conflict with Pakistan took on such salience. He would say, the line he uses, we're going to pay it back with interest. Well, that sets up this dynamic where if what they hit in Balakot wasn't enough, and there's a follow-on attack, does that commit him to hit something else? And where? There are only a limited number of targets like Balakot, kind of on a hillside. And Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is mainland Pakistan, but it's not Punjab, right? It's not urban Pakistan. And the Indians claimed it wasn't a military target and it wasn't a civilian target because it was basically a madrasa for Jaish-e-Mohammed. And so the next time around, the Pakistanis are just going to vacate targets like that. So what are you going to hit? What's left? What's the next rung up in the conventional escalatory ladder where you think you can stay below Pakistan's thresholds? And I'm kind of nervous as to see where they will go. And Part of that is the deterrence dynamic, but I don't know that that's going to deter the Pakistanis, particularly since the Pakistanis have told themselves a story where the Indians didn't really destroy much at Balakot. And if you look at the February 27th balance, the Pakistanis can tell themselves a story where they came out ahead. Shot down a MiG-21. India lost an Mi-17 in friendly fire. And there's still this litigation about the PAF F-16, but, I think quietly most at least I believe that the U.S. government assessment is that no Pakistani Air Force F-16 was killed. And if you're Pakistan, you think, okay, well, we held our own. And so I'm not sure that the deterrence dynamic that the Modi government wanted to establish by hitting Balakot has actually been established.
Right. Pakistani optimism remains unflagging.
Correct.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Optimism is a terrible thing, children.
Well, and both sides, and especially both sides have that. And if you're Indian, you say, we had resolve. We showed a tremendous amount of resolve. And so that was really helpful, I think, in de-escalating the Balakot crisis because the pilot was handed over and the Indians, Prime Minister Modi said he was ready for, to initiate surface-to-surface missile strikes if the pilot, Abhinandan, wasn't handed over expeditiously. So thankfully he was. But, both sides have this narrative which helped de-escalate that they won, and that helped satisfy the domestic political constituencies. But if they both really believe that, then, they both can't be right. So you set up this dynamic where you can get further escalation next time as the Indians try to, push up on the threshold, and the Pakistanis may say, look, now you've crossed it now, and we can hold our own so we can retaliate also.
Oh, joy. All right. Well, let's enough of that part of the world.
Only happy stories here.
Yeah, no, all right. Let's turn to China. And so I think maybe two parts here. One, it seems that U.S. concerns about China's modernizing nuclear forces is influencing American military strategy, and sort of part two related, the Trump administration withdrawing from INF, and has made it clear that they'd like to involve China in sort of maybe a INF 2.0 or something like that. And I think maybe they don't understand.
I think it's a poison pill. You just, talking about China on any arms control agreement right now, whether it's INF or New START, is just a way, I think, an excuse to not have an arms control agreement. I mean, they're trying to square the circle and look like they're in favor of arms control, but knowing full well that it's dead on arrival. So I don't think there's any interest on the Chinese side in getting involved, especially, the INF treaty was time-specific, time-bound, geographically bound for Europe. Doesn't make sense in Asia, especially if you're China, right? I mean, you need INF-range GLICMs and ballistic missiles. So the reality is the Chinese are never going to on board with the INF. And New START, what is the New START number for China? 0, right? Or close to 0, depending on. I mean,
we should all
very
have Chinese nuclear postures. That
right,
would be
exactly.
goal, right?
No deployed strategic nuclear system. Very few. I mean, not very many, if there are any. I don't know the actual number.
Probably in the tens of where it count.
Yeah. Right.
So, which leads into a good question about, what do you see as some common misperceptions among U.S. leaders, whether it be executive or legislative branch, about what China's nuclear force posture is?
Right.
Because I know, I work a lot in this space, and I notice a lot of people talking about China and their nuclear forces and making certain statements about, how scary it is, or they're modernizing, and
it's a great question.
But it seems like they miss a lot.
I think the most common misperception is that Chinese nuclear strategy has not changed in decades, but the requirements to achieve that strategy are obviously dictated by not only U.S. forces, but U.S. missile defenses. And so if you're China and you think, how do I want an assured retaliation strategy, I am willing, and I think of any no first use policy in the world, China's maybe the closest to being credible, even though I think it's very difficult to make any no first use policy credible. Mm-hmm. I think China's probably the most credible, just the way they steward their forces. And so I think for the longest time, China actually did not have an assured retaliation posture. I think in my book, I call it plausible retaliation. But now you're facing a more sophisticated and layered and a thicker American missile defense system, both in the region, and you have to worry about what's going to happen with our GMD down the road. Now, even if there is this, common claimant, which I agree with, ground-based missile defense, mid-course missile defense doesn't work today, and it doesn't, not particularly well. But there's no guarantee that we may not be able to get it to work against a handful of weapons in the future. And if you're China and the U.S. says, our GMD is really, sized for North Korea or for Iran or rogue actors, you're China, you're thinking, okay, that's right, but America also has this really, terrifying counterforce capability, and both conventional and nuclear. So the concern, if I'm Chinese nuclear planners, is the U.S. can make my force look like North Korea's with a first strike, and then I may have nothing or very few left to retaliate against. And a missile defense that is sized for North Korea, once you make my force look like North Korea's, also works against me. So I think all of the developments that we saw on display in the parade, or what they wanted us to see what they want us to think they were developing, the DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicle. I mean, all of that is about maneuverability to defeat missile defenses. The DF-41, MIRV capabilities is to saturate missile defense. A lot of this, it's not the U.S. nuclear posture that worries the Chinese; it's missile defenses, and everything that they're developing from SSBNs and SLBMs to hypersonic glide vehicles to penetration aids and MIRVs and heavy E and mobile solid fuel ICBMs. It's about survivability against the first counterforce attempt and then being able to penetrate against missile defenses. And those are the requirements now to achieve assured retaliation against the United States, because we have improved, across the board in both counterforce and with missile defenses. So I think the biggest myth is that the Chinese force structure does not represent a new strategy or posture. It is to implement the old strategy and posture as those requirements change in the face of what is an incredibly sophisticated and terrifying U.S. Nuclear force structure and missile defense.
It's not trying to match the U.S. at all. But it's easy to kind of, if the narrative in Washington is, oh shoot, China is now the big bad, they're the big threat.
Yeah, I think there are political interests in making that story. I mean, I think there are two things. I think one, for less sophisticated analysts or nuclear, especially, if they have a political agenda, right? The dynamism doesn't, either they're in willful denial about the dynamic requirements for assured retaliation, or it's in service of a political agenda. As we're academics or analysts, we're free to say whatever we think. But I think, it's when I look at nuclear modernization programs from Russia to China, they're all driven by missile defenses. And, I think it would be naive for us to think that, our missile defenses don't put a lot of pressure on these countries. And that's, I think, a lot of the aim of missile defense. I think part of missile defense is, even if it doesn't work, it forces your adversary to build up and modernize and spend a lot of money. And look at what
the self-licking ice cream cone that the Hawks have loved since Reagan birthed this terrible idea in the 80s. It's destabilizing. It's terrible. And if people really believed that missile defense was only to defend against rogue nation missile attacks, then we would give the technology to everyone, because that would be the way to protect everyone from these sorts of things. And then, but we don't do that, of course. And then we pretend that,
but and you look at the cost that like Russia is willing to run. I mean, the nuclear-powered cruise missile in the accident, killed 5 Russian nuclear scientists, and that's a real cost, and it's all driven by the fear of missile defenses and needing to have something that can evade missile defenses eventually.
I mean, but then that also begs the question of, well, if our goal is to spend a little to get them to spend themselves into oblivion, why do we keep pumping in money into systems that just don't work?
Because one day it might. I mean, one, it makes it credible, but I also think there's a constituency that there's a constituency that wants to get this to work.
Gotta keep that Raytheon stock up, right?
All right, so let's to wrap things up. Let's pull back the aperture a little bit, widen the aperture, and sort of ask. These are the hot spots today. If you look forward, I don't know, 5, 10, whatever the number of years you need to look forward, what are some things we're going to be talking about more down the road?
It depends. I think a lot of this turns on one thing that's kind of a microcosm of the broader geopolitical trends. Or I think a lot of India believed that the United States, which in the past has tried to restrain New Delhi from retaliating with kinetic action after a terrorist attack, with the message that it doesn't end well. There's no good that can come of it. If what you have to do to reestablish deterrence, you can't do, and so why risk escalation unnecessarily? This time, I think the Indians believe, at least based on public reporting and discussions I've had in Delhi, that the U.S. basically gave India green light to retaliate. John Bolton's readout made it seem like you got to do what you got to do. And we only got involved like late when then it looked like things were going to potentially spin out of control. And Secretary Pompeo was on the phone. But at that point, India and Pakistan also didn't really have an interest in going to war. I think the biggest geopolitical development in 5 years will be if this trend line continues and U.S. retrenchment from global affairs continues. We will see more nuclear powers. We will see less American management or involvement with crises between nuclear powers, and sometimes that may result in really dangerous escalatory dynamics. So when I look 5 years down the road, if this trend line continues, it's not out of the realm of possibility. We're already seeing in the Middle East. We haven't talked about Iran, but we're already seeing the Middle East and the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia hedging their bets on nuclear technologies, which obviously have are driven by their desire, I think, to have a nuclear weapons hedge in some form or another. And in Asia, Japan is essentially a virtual nuclear weapon state, and it's not out. Maybe South Korea doesn't go or does, depending on their government. But we may be in a world where we see a lot more virtual nuclear states or hedgers, and their nuclear tinge crises. And the biggest geopolitical challenge, I think, in the next 5 years, depending on what happens in the election next year, is American retrenchment. I think a lot of nuclear powers in the world, and I think a lot of countries are not thinking about it. I think Kim Jong-un is betting on it. For him, it's perfect. But for India and Pakistan, and for even China, I'm not sure what the world looks like, because in a lot of ways, for better and worse, the United States has been the policeman when it's come to nuclear tinge crises in the world. And if the U.S. abdicates, then that could portend both more nuclear powers and more dangerous nuclear crises. I think for me, that's a big wild card. That's why I think the election next year, if President Trump wins again, I think that becomes the 4 years of a foreign policy ideology can be reversed, but 8 years is much more hard. Is much more difficult.
Right. Yeah. But by retrenchment, I think it might be better to say utter diffidence, because I think retrenchment sort of suggests that you're pulling troops and things out of it. It's more maybe a diplomatic retrenchment in that sense.
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. President Trump thinks alliances are costly. He doesn't value the alliances the way 70 years of American foreign policy and president's bipartisan consensus has. I think Kim Jong-un can't believe his luck to have a president that may actually prefer a weaker alliance with the South Koreans because he doesn't see the value. And, shaking down the allies the way he has, this morning with Turkey, this is a NATO ally. And this is an open threat against a NATO ally. Now, granted, Turkey is, kind of unique in the NATO system, but
that's a diplomatic way to put it.
Nevertheless, this is, and, I think 4 years, the rest of the world and our allies are probably willing to give us 1 term, but 2 terms of this political and foreign policy ideology might be very difficult, I think, to reverse very quickly or very easily after the fact. And so that's a big wild card. So, I think we're going to see more nuclear states regardless, but depending on, how the U.S. approaches the world, both in the next year. If the next year is just riled up with these domestic political concerns and impeachment hearings, et cetera, then the U.S. the administration won't have the bandwidth to deal with any crises that emerge. And, the most dangerous crises are the ones that blindside you, right? The slow burn crises we can see, but it's the terrorist attacks in India that spin up really quickly. And are you prepared, if you're focused so much on impeachment as an administration, to deal with that when it comes up? I would say no.
That is a dark and appropriate place to leave the conversation. Thanks so much for joining us today,
Awesome.
Vipin.
Thanks, guys. That was a lot of fun.
And thanks to our producer,
I don't know if
Cecil.
fun is the right word. That was,
it was
interesting.
Nukes.
Yeah,
it's what we do.
Thanks to our producer, Cecil Sherman, and to all of you for listening. To continue the conversation, our Twitter handle is @PowerProblems. And if you like the show, please do leave us a good review on iTunes or wherever you find your podcasts.